Welcome to this journey through one of the most unsettling cases recorded in Montgomery, Alabama history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing how far and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In 1856, Montgomery was a city caught between elegance and brutality, where grand mansions lined the Alabama River while the cotton trade fed an economy built on human suffering. It was in this setting that the Grant family commissioned what they believed would be a simple memorial portrait of their daughter, Constance Grant, who had passed away just 3 days before her 21st birthday. The daguerreotypist, a traveling photographer named Samuel Morrison, was known throughout the region for his skill in post-mortem photography, a common practice that allowed grieving families to preserve one final image of their loved ones. The Grant estate sat on 12 acres of rolling hills just outside Montgomery's city limits, accessible by a winding dirt road that branched off from the main thoroughfare connecting Montgomery to Wetumpka. The house itself was a 2-story Greek Revival structure with 6 massive columns supporting a wraparound veranda that offered views of the cotton fields stretching toward the Coosa River Valley. Elijah Grant, a prominent cotton merchant and landowner, had built the estate in 1849 with profits from his extensive holdings throughout Montgomery County. Morrison arrived at the Grant estate on a humid Tuesday morning in late August, his photographic equipment loaded in a specially designed wagon that protected the delicate glass plates and chemical solutions required for the daguerreotype process. He had received the commission through a letter delivered by one of Grant's house servants, a brief message requesting his services for a memorial portrait of the family's recently deceased daughter. The fee offered was generous, more than Morrison typically charged, which he attributed to the Grant family's wealth and social standing in Montgomery society. The photographer was escorted to the main house by Martha Grant, Elijah's wife of 23 years, a woman whose composure seemed carved from the same marble as the estate's decorative columns. She led him through the front parlor, past furniture draped in black cloth according to mourning customs, to a smaller sitting room, where Constance Grant's body had been prepared for the photographic session. The young woman had been dressed in a white silk gown with intricate lacework, her dark hair arranged in ringlets that framed her pale face. Her hands were positioned across her chest in the traditional manner, giving the appearance of peaceful sleep. Morrison began his preparations methodically, arranging his camera stand and mixing the chemical solutions needed to prepare the photographic plates. The process required absolute stillness for several minutes while the image was captured, which made post-mortem photography technically easier than photographing living subjects who might move during the long exposure time. Mrs. Grant remained in the room throughout the setup process, occasionally adjusting her daughter's dress or smoothing an errant strand of hair with the careful attention of a mother who still hoped to provide comfort to her child. As Morrison positioned his camera and prepared the first plate, he noticed something unusual about the arrangement of Constance Grant's hands. While they appeared to be folded peacefully across her chest, there was a slight asymmetry that suggested something had been placed beneath the white silk fabric. When he mentioned this observation to Mrs. Grant, she became visibly agitated, her composed demeanor cracking slightly as she insisted that everything was exactly as it should be. Morrison decided not to pursue the matter further, attributing the irregularity to the natural settling of the body after death. The first daguerreotype was taken according to standard practices, with Morrison exposing the plate for approximately 4 minutes while ensuring that no movement disturbed the camera or its subject. After developing the image in his portable darkroom, he examined the result and found it to be technically satisfactory, though there was an unusual shadow pattern across the lower portion of Constance's gown that he could not immediately explain. Mrs. Grant requested that he take a second image from a slightly different angle, citing concerns about the lighting conditions in the room. For the second exposure, Morrison repositioned his equipment and adjusted the window coverings to modify the natural light filtering into the sitting room. During this process, he observed Mrs. Grant speaking quietly to someone in the hallway, though he could not make out the words being exchanged. When she returned to the room, she appeared more agitated than before, repeatedly smoothing the fabric of her daughter's dress and adjusting the positioning of objects on a nearby table. Morrison noted these behaviors in his professional journal, as unusual client reactions sometimes affected the quality of photographic sessions. The second daguerreotype was exposed for 5 minutes to compensate for the changed lighting conditions. When Morrison developed this plate in his wagon's darkroom, he discovered an image that would haunt him for the remainder of his career. The photograph clearly showed Constance Grant in her white burial gown, but her hands were no longer folded peacefully across her chest. Instead, her right hand appeared to be gripping the handle of a long kitchen knife that protruded from beneath the silk fabric, the blade's edge catching the window light in a thin line of silver that seemed to divide the image diagonally. Morrison examined the plate multiple times, convinced that some flaw in the chemical process or contamination of the glass had created this impossible effect. Post-mortem daguerreotypes occasionally contained strange artifacts due to chemical reactions or environmental factors, but this image appeared too precise and detailed to be explained by technical error. The knife was clearly visible, its wooden handle worn smooth by years of use, its steel blade reflecting light with photographic accuracy. More disturbing still was the positioning of Constance's fingers around the handle, which suggested a firm grip rather than the passive placement that Morrison had observed during the actual photographic session. When Morrison returned to the sitting room to inform Mrs. Grant about the anomaly in the second photograph, he found the room empty except for Constance's body, which remained exactly as he had positioned it for the photographic session. Her hands were still folded across her chest in the traditional manner, with no sign of any knife or other object concealed beneath her burial gown. Morrison carefully examined the body and the surrounding area, searching for any explanation for the image captured on the daguerreotype plate, but found nothing that could account for what appeared in the photograph. Mrs. Grant returned to the room, accompanied by her husband, Elijah Grant, a tall man with graying hair and the weathered hands of someone accustomed to physical labor despite his wealth. When Morrison explained the situation and showed them the second daguerreotype, both parents examined the image in silence for several minutes before Elijah Grant asked to see the first photograph as well. Upon comparing the two images, it became apparent that both showed the same impossible detail. Constance Grant holding a knife that was not physically present on her body during either photographic session. The conversation that followed was conducted in hushed tones, with both parents speaking in fragments that suggested they were discussing something Morrison was not meant to hear. Mrs. Grant repeatedly mentioned what she knew and what she might have written, while her husband's responses centered on keeping the family name clean and ensuring that certain matters remained buried with the dead. Morrison realized that his presence was complicating a private family matter, but his professional obligations required him to deliver the commissioned photographs regardless of their unusual content. Elijah Grant eventually offered to purchase both daguerreotype plates along with their corresponding images, proposing a sum 3 times larger than Morrison's original fee. He explained that the family preferred to handle the unusual photographs privately and requested that Morrison sign a written agreement stating that he would not discuss the session or create copies of the images for any purpose. Morrison agreed to these terms, partly because of the substantial payment and partly because he had no desire to be associated with what appeared to be an unexplainable supernatural occurrence. Before leaving the Grant estate, Morrison was permitted to examine Constance's body one final time to ensure that his equipment had not somehow disturbed the funeral arrangements. During this examination, he noticed that the young woman's fingernails contained traces of what appeared to be dried blood, though her hands showed no visible wounds that could account for this staining. When he mentioned this observation to Mrs. Grant, she explained that Constance had been ill for several weeks before her death and had suffered from nosebleeds that sometimes stained her hands when she attempted to stem the flow. Morrison departed the Grant estate with more questions than answers, carrying his photographic equipment and a substantial payment that felt heavier than it should have in his coat pocket. The wagon ride back to Montgomery provided him with time to consider what he had witnessed, but no amount of reflection could produce a rational explanation for the impossible images captured on his daguerreotype plates. He had been practicing photography for 8 years, and had never encountered anything that challenged his understanding of the medium's technical limitations in such a direct and undeniable way. Upon returning to Montgomery, Morrison immediately wrote a detailed account of the photographic session in his professional journal, documenting every aspect of the experience while the details remained fresh in his memory. He described the Grant family's behavior, the unusual shadows in the first photograph, and the impossible knife visible in the second image. This journal entry would later prove to be the only written record of the events at the Grant estate, as Morrison honored his agreement not to discuss the matter publicly for the remainder of his life. 3 days after the photographic session, Morrison received word that Constance Grant had been reburied in a private ceremony attended only by immediate family members. The gravesite was located in the Grant family cemetery, a small plot of land on the estate property surrounded by wrought iron fencing and shaded by ancient oak trees. According to the funeral director who handled the arrangements, the family had requested that the burial take place at dawn to avoid attracting attention from Montgomery's social circles, who might have expected a more elaborate public funeral for a member of such a prominent family. Morrison's curiosity about the Grant family's circumstances led him to make discreet inquiries among Montgomery's business community, where Elijah Grant was well known for his cotton trading operations. These conversations revealed that Grant had been experiencing financial difficulties in recent months, with several large shipments failing to reach their intended destinations due to problems with transportation and storage. Some merchants suggested that Grant's troubles were connected to his daughter's behavior during the weeks before her death, though none were willing to provide specific details about what she might have done. The photographer also learned that Constance Grant had been engaged to marry Thomas Whitfield, the son of another prominent Montgomery family, with the wedding planned for October of 1856. The engagement had been announced in the Montgomery Advertiser 6 months before Constance's death, and the planned union was expected to strengthen business relationships between the Grant and Whitfield families. However, Morrison discovered that the engagement had been quietly dissolved just 2 weeks before Constance's death, with no public explanation provided for the change in circumstances. Further investigation revealed that Thomas Whitfield had left Montgomery abruptly in mid-August, reportedly traveling to his family's holdings in Mississippi for an extended stay that was expected to last through the winter months. Friends of the Whitfield family suggested that Thomas had suffered some kind of emotional disturbance that made it inadvisable for him to remain in Montgomery, though the specific nature of his condition was not discussed openly. The timing of his departure, occurring just days before Constance Grant's death, struck Morrison as more than coincidental. Morrison's journal entries from this period reflect his growing conviction that Constance Grant's death was connected to events involving her former fiancé and possibly other members of Montgomery's social elite. He noted that several families who had been close to the Grants appeared to be avoiding any mention of Constance or her circumstances, responding to questions about her death with brief condolences that discouraged further conversation. This pattern of evasion suggested to Morrison that there were aspects of the situation that the community preferred to keep buried, along with the young woman herself. 2 weeks after the photographic session, Morrison encountered Dr. Harrison Blackwood, the physician who had attended Constance Grant during her final illness. Dr. Blackwood was known throughout Montgomery as a competent and discreet medical practitioner who served many of the city's wealthiest families. During a chance meeting at Morrison's photographic studio, the doctor mentioned that Constance Grant's death had troubled him professionally, though he was careful not to provide details that would violate patient confidentiality. When Morrison pressed for more information, Dr. Blackwood revealed that Constance had sought medical attention for what she described as wounds that would not heal properly, though physical examination had revealed no visible injuries that could account for her complaints. She had also reported experiencing severe nightmares and periods of memory loss that began approximately 1 month before her death. Dr. Blackwood had prescribed laudanum to help her sleep, but Constance had refused the medication, stating that she needed to remain alert for reasons she would not explain. The doctor also mentioned that Constance had asked him repeatedly about the effects of various poisons, claiming that she was researching the topic for a novel she planned to write. Her questions were unusually specific and focused on substances that would cause gradual deterioration rather than immediate death. Dr. Blackwood had found these inquiries disturbing enough to discuss them with her parents, but they had assured him that Constance was simply pursuing an intellectual interest in medical subjects and meant no harm to herself or others. During their conversation, Dr. Blackwood expressed his belief that Constance Grant had been suffering from some form of mental disturbance that may have been connected to her broken engagement or other personal disappointments. He suggested that young women of her social class sometimes developed nervous conditions when faced with circumstances that conflicted with their expected roles in society. However, he acknowledged that her specific symptoms did not match any recognized pattern of female hysteria or nervous exhaustion. Morrison realized that Dr. Blackwood's observations aligned with his own suspicions about the circumstances surrounding Constance Grant's death. The combination of her interest in poisons, her reports of unhealable wounds, and her refusal of medical treatment suggested that she had been involved in something more complex than a simple illness or nervous breakdown. The impossible knife in the daguerreotype images took on new significance when considered alongside these medical details, suggesting that Constance may have been planning or carrying out some action that required a weapon. As autumn progressed, Morrison found his thoughts returning repeatedly to the Grant photographic session and its aftermath. He began researching the history of the Grant family and their connections within Montgomery society, hoping to understand the context that might explain Constance's unusual behavior and mysterious death. This research revealed that the Grant family had been involved in several business disputes during the past year, including accusations that Elijah Grant had been adulterating his cotton shipments with inferior materials to increase his profits. More significantly, Morrison discovered that the Grant estate had been the site of several unexplained incidents during the months before Constance's death. Local newspapers had reported the disappearance of 2 house servants who had worked for the family for several years, though the articles suggested that both individuals had simply chosen to seek employment elsewhere. However, conversations with other domestic workers in the area revealed that both servants had left the Grant estate suddenly, without collecting their final wages or taking their personal possessions. Morrison also learned that neighbors of the Grant estate had complained about strange sounds emanating from the property during late-night hours. describing what they characterized as rhythmic pounding that seemed to come from beneath the main house. When questioned by local authorities, the Grant family had explained that they were conducting renovations to the basement areas and apologized for any disturbance to the surrounding community. However, no evidence of construction work was visible from outside the estate, and the sounds had continued sporadically until just before Constance's death. These discoveries prompted Morrison to reconsider the significance of the knife visible in the daguerreotype images. Rather than representing some supernatural manifestation, the weapon might have been a real object that Constance Grant had hidden on her person for reasons connected to her family's circumstances. The impossibility lay not in the knife's existence, but in its appearance in photographs taken after her death, when her body had been prepared for burial by others who should have discovered any concealed objects. Morrison began to suspect that someone had deliberately placed the knife with Constance's body after her death, possibly as a message or warning intended for family members who would view the photographs. This theory suggested that Constance's death had not been the end of whatever conflict had been brewing within the Grant household, but rather one event in a continuing struggle that involved multiple parties with access to her body between her death and the photographic session. The photographer's investigation took a new direction when he learned that the Grant family had dismissed their entire domestic staff just days after Constance's burial, paying each servant a substantial sum in exchange for their immediate departure from Montgomery. According to records maintained by the local employment registry, the Grant family had hired a completely new staff from other regions of Alabama, bringing in workers who had no previous connections to Montgomery's established social networks. This massive staff turnover struck Morrison as an attempt to eliminate potential witnesses to events that had occurred within the Grant household. Morrison's research also revealed that Thomas Whitfield had not traveled to Mississippi as initially reported, but had instead been admitted to a private sanitarium in Tennessee for treatment of what his family described as a nervous breakdown. Medical records obtained through discreet inquiries indicated that Whitfield was suffering from severe nightmares and episodes of violent behavior that made him dangerous to himself and others. His condition had begun deteriorating in July of 1856, approximately 1 month before his engagement to Constance Grant was dissolved. The timeline of events began to form a clearer pattern when Morrison discovered that both Constance Grant and Thomas Whitfield had been present at a private gathering hosted by the Whitfield family in early July. The event had been organized as a celebration of their upcoming marriage, with attendance limited to immediate family members and a few close friends. According to society reports published in local newspapers, the gathering had been curtailed unexpectedly when Constance Grant became ill and had to be escorted home by her parents. Morrison obtained more detailed information about this gathering from Sarah Pemberton, a seamstress who had been hired to alter Constance's dress for the occasion. Mrs. Pemberton recalled that Constance had appeared agitated and distracted during the fitting sessions, repeatedly asking questions about the other guests who would be attending the celebration. She had been particularly interested in learning about the Whitfield family's business associates and had asked specific questions about men who had recently arrived in Montgomery from other parts of the South. According to Mrs. Pemberton, Constance had also made unusual requests regarding the dress itself, asking for hidden pockets to be sewn into the skirt and requesting that the sleeves be designed to conceal her arms completely. These modifications struck the seamstress as strange, since the celebration was planned as a warm-weather outdoor event where lighter fabrics and more revealing styles would have been more appropriate. When Mrs. Pemberton asked about the reasoning behind these requests, Constance had explained that she needed to carry certain items with her and preferred not to use a traditional reticule. Mrs. Pemberton's account provided Morrison with his first concrete evidence that Constance Grant had been planning something specific for the Whitfield family gathering. The seamstress had also observed what appeared to be bruising on Constance's arms and shoulders, though the young woman had refused to discuss these marks when questioned about them. Mrs. Pemberton had assumed that the bruises were the result of some accident or illness, but their pattern and location suggested that they might have been caused by forceful restraint or struggle. The seamstress also revealed that Constance had asked her to recommend a reliable source for purchasing certain household items, specifically mentioning kitchen knives and cleaning supplies. Mrs. Pemberton had provided the names of several Montgomery merchants who sold quality domestic goods, though she had found it unusual for a young woman of Constance's social standing to be personally involved in such practical household purchases. Most families of their economic level left such matters to their domestic staff or to female relatives with more experience in household management. Morrison realized that Mrs. Pemberton's observations aligned with Dr. Blackwood's medical notes and his own photographic evidence to suggest that Constance Grant had been systematically preparing for some kind of confrontation or action that required both weapons and concealment. The knife visible in the daguerreotype images was likely one of several items she had acquired for this purpose, though the specific target of her intended action remained unclear. Her engagement to Thomas Whitfield placed her at the center of Montgomery's social and business networks, providing her with access to information and individuals that might not have been available to other young women of her generation. The photographer's investigation revealed that the Whitfield family gathering in July had concluded abruptly, not because of Constance's illness, but because of a violent altercation between Thomas Whitfield and several business associates of his father. According to witnesses who spoke to Morrison in confidence, Thomas had accused these men of participating in activities that violated both legal and moral standards, though the specific nature of his accusations was not recorded in any official documentation. The confrontation had escalated to the point where physical intervention was required to prevent Thomas from attacking one of the guests with a serving knife he had taken from the dining table. This incident had occurred in full view of Constance Grant and several other family members, marking the beginning of the events that would lead to both Thomas's mental breakdown and Constance's mysterious death. Morrison learned that Constance had remained calm throughout the confrontation, even helping to restrain Thomas when his behavior became dangerous to the other guests. However, several witnesses noted that she had appeared more angry than frightened by what she observed, suggesting that Thomas's accusations had confirmed suspicions she already harbored about the men he was accusing. In the days following the confrontation, Constance Grant had begun making discreet inquiries about the business activities of various Montgomery merchants and planters, focusing particularly on their connections to transportation networks and financial institutions in other parts of the South. She had posed these questions as research for the novel she claimed to be writing, but her inquiries were too specific and targeted to support such an explanation. Morrison discovered that she had obtained detailed information about cotton shipping routes, warehouse operations, and banking practices that would have been useful for someone planning to disrupt or expose illegal activities. Constance's research had also extended to the personal lives and family connections of several prominent Montgomery citizens, including men who had business relationships with both her father and the Whitfield family. She had questioned servants, tradespeople, and other members of the community who might have observed activities that were not visible to Montgomery's social elite. This pattern of investigation suggested that she was building a comprehensive understanding of a network or conspiracy that involved multiple parties working together for illegal purposes. Morrison's research revealed that Constance Grant had been particularly interested in learning about the movements and activities of traveling merchants who passed through Montgomery on regular schedules. She had visited the offices of several transportation companies, asking detailed questions about shipping manifests and storage procedures that went far beyond casual curiosity about commercial operations. Her inquiries had focused especially on shipments that originated in Montgomery but were destined for markets in New Orleans and other southern ports where goods could be transferred to international vessels. The pattern of Constance's research suggested that she had uncovered evidence of a smuggling or fraud operation that used legitimate cotton trading as cover for more profitable illegal activities. Montgomery's location on the Alabama River made it a natural hub for shipping goods to Gulf Coast ports, and the complexity of the cotton trade provided numerous opportunities for concealing other types of cargo within legitimate shipments. Constance's father's financial difficulties suddenly made sense if his business was being used without his knowledge to facilitate such activities, with the perpetrators claiming larger shares of the profits than their legitimate partnerships would justify. Morrison learned that Constance had also been investigating the backgrounds of several men who had recently arrived in Montgomery, claiming to be potential investors in local cotton operations. These individuals had established temporary residences in the city and had been accepted into social circles based on letters of introduction from business contacts in other regions. However, Constance's research had revealed that some of these introductory letters were forgeries, and that the men they endorsed had criminal histories in their regions of origin. The photographer realized that Constance Grant had discovered information that threatened the financial interests and legal safety of several prominent Montgomery citizens, including her own father and her former fiancé's family. Her broken engagement to Thomas Whitfield had likely resulted from their shared knowledge of these criminal activities, with Thomas's mental breakdown representing his inability to cope with the moral implications of what they had uncovered. Constance's apparent decision to take direct action against the perpetrators had led to her death and the subsequent cover-up that Morrison had witnessed. Morrison's investigation reached a critical point when he learned that Elijah Grant had been secretly negotiating the sale of his estate and cotton operations to a consortium of buyers from New Orleans. The sale was being structured to take effect in January of 1857, just 5 months after Constance's death, and included provisions that would allow Grant to relocate to Texas with sufficient funds to establish a new business operation far from Montgomery's social and legal jurisdiction. This information suggested that Grant was extracting himself from the criminal network that had compromised his business, possibly using his daughter's death as leverage to secure favorable terms for his departure. The photographer also discovered that Thomas Whitfield's family had made similar preparations for relocating their operations, though their plans involved transferring assets to relatives in Mississippi rather than selling to outside parties. The coordination between these two families' exit strategies suggested that they were responding to a common threat, most likely the exposure of their criminal activities through Constance Grant's investigation. Morrison realized that both families were treating her death not as a tragedy to be mourned, but as a problem to be managed through careful financial and legal maneuvering. Morrison's research revealed that the private sanitarium where Thomas Whitfield was receiving treatment specialized in caring for individuals whose mental disturbances were connected to legal or financial scandals that their families preferred to keep confidential. The facility's patient records, obtained through Morrison's connections with medical professionals, indicated that Whitfield was suffering from guilt and paranoia related to his involvement in activities that had harmed other people. His violent episodes were triggered specifically by discussions of women or children, suggesting that the criminal network he had helped expose was involved in particularly heinous activities. The photographer began to understand that Constance Grant's death had not been the result of illness or accident, but had been orchestrated by individuals who recognized that her investigation threatened their criminal operations. The knife visible in the daguerreotype images was evidence that she had been prepared to defend herself or take offensive action against her killers, but had been overpowered before she could use the weapon effectively. Someone with access to her body after death had positioned the knife with her remains as a warning to others who might consider exposing the truth about her murder. Morrison realized that his own role in documenting Constance Grant's death had made him a potential liability to the same individuals who had killed her. His photographic evidence proved that her death had involved circumstances that contradicted the official family explanation of natural causes, and his investigation had uncovered information that could be used to expose the criminal network she had been investigating. The substantial payment he had received for the daguerreotype session suddenly seemed less like generous compensation and more like an attempt to purchase his silence about what he had witnessed. The photographer began taking precautions to protect himself and preserve the evidence he had gathered, including creating duplicate copies of his journal entries and distributing them to trusted contacts in other cities. He also prepared a detailed written account of his investigation and arranged for it to be published posthumously if he died under suspicious circumstances. These preparations proved prescient when Morrison began receiving visits from men who claimed to represent various business interests in Montgomery, all of whom expressed concerns about rumors that might damage the reputations of prominent citizens. Morrison's visitors used carefully worded language that avoided direct threats while making it clear that his continued health depended on his discretion regarding the Grant family photographic session. They offered additional payments for his silence and suggested that his photographic business would benefit from their patronage if he proved reliable. However, they also mentioned that photographers who became involved in private family matters sometimes found their equipment damaged or their professional reputations compromised by unfounded accusations of improper behavior. The photographer understood that he was being given a choice between accepting permanent silence about Constance Grant's murder or facing the same fate that had befallen her. Morrison chose to accept the offered payments while secretly continuing his investigation, using the additional funds to prepare for an eventual departure from Montgomery that would allow him to publish his findings safely. He maintained his normal business operations, while carefully documenting every contact with individuals connected to the Grant family case, building a comprehensive record that would support future legal action against Constance's killers. Morrison's research revealed that the criminal network exposed by Constance Grant extended far beyond Montgomery's business community, involving corruption in law enforcement and local government that made it impossible to seek justice through normal legal channels. Several prominent officials who should have investigated her death were receiving regular payments from the same individuals who had profited from the illegal activities she had discovered. This corruption explained why her death had been quickly accepted as natural causes, despite evidence that should have prompted a formal investigation. The photographer learned that Constance Grant had been planning to take her evidence to federal authorities in Washington, bypassing the compromised local justice system to expose the criminal network that had infiltrated Montgomery's economy and government. Her investigation had revealed that the illegal activities were part of a larger operation that violated federal laws regarding interstate commerce and taxation, making them subject to prosecution by national rather than local authorities. Her killers had acted to prevent this evidence from reaching federal investigators who would have been beyond their ability to bribe or intimidate. Morrison realized that Constance Grant had been more than just a curious young woman who stumbled upon criminal activities. She had been conducting a sophisticated investigation that threatened a conspiracy involving millions of dollars in illegal profits and dozens of prominent citizens throughout Alabama and neighboring states. Her death had been carefully planned and executed by individuals with extensive resources and connections, explaining why the cover-up had been so thorough and why witnesses had been either eliminated or coerced into silence. The photographer's investigation revealed that the knife visible in the daguerreotype images had been placed with Constance's body by someone who wanted to ensure that evidence of her murder would be preserved, even if all other proof was destroyed. This individual had likely been working with Constance during her investigation and had survived her killing long enough to create this photographic record. Morrison suspected that this person was among the domestic servants who had been dismissed from the Grant household after Constance's burial, but his attempts to locate these individuals proved unsuccessful. Morrison's research indicated that several of the dismissed Grant servants had left Montgomery permanently, receiving payments that suggested they had been both rewarded for their silence and encouraged to relocate far from Alabama. However, one servant named Rebecca Washington had disappeared entirely with no record of her departure or subsequent whereabouts. Morrison suspected that Rebecca had been the person who placed the knife with Constance's body and had been killed to prevent her from revealing what she knew about the murder. The photographer's investigation eventually led him to conclude that Constance Grant had been poisoned over a period of several weeks, explaining Dr. Blackwood's observations about her gradual deterioration and her complaints of wounds that would not heal. The poison had been administered in doses small enough to avoid immediate suspicion while causing cumulative damage that would eventually result in death appearing to be from natural causes. This method had allowed her killers to monitor her investigation and determine the appropriate timing for her death, based on how close she was to exposing their activities. Morrison learned that the poison used to kill Constance Grant was likely arsenic, which could be obtained easily from various commercial sources and administered through food or drink without being detected by its victims until significant damage had occurred. The symptoms Dr. Blackwood had recorded matched the effects of chronic arsenic poisoning, and the timing of her deterioration aligned with the schedule of her investigation into the criminal network. Her killers had probably begun poisoning her shortly after the confrontation at the Whitfield family gathering, when they realized that she possessed dangerous knowledge about their activities. The photographer's research revealed that arsenic poisoning had been used in several other suspicious deaths in Montgomery during the 1850s, suggesting that Constance Grant's murder was part of a pattern of eliminating individuals who threatened the criminal network's operations. These deaths had all been attributed to natural causes or accidents, and no formal investigations had been conducted, despite evidence that should have raised questions about their circumstances. The pattern indicated a systematic approach to silencing potential witnesses that had been refined through previous experience. Morrison realized that his own investigation had identified him as another potential threat to the criminal network, making his eventual murder almost inevitable unless he could find a way to expose the conspiracy or escape Montgomery safely. The photographer began making preparations for both possibilities, creating multiple copies of his evidence and establishing contacts with law enforcement officials in other states who might be willing to pursue federal charges against Constance Grant's killers. He also began planning a route of escape that would take him far from Alabama before his absence from Montgomery could be noticed and reported to his potential killers. The photographer's investigation reached its conclusion when he discovered that the Grant family's planned sale of their estate included a provision requiring the buyers to ensure that all existing graves on the property were relocated to public cemeteries. This requirement meant that Constance Grant's body would be exhumed within months of Morrison's photographic session, providing an opportunity for any evidence concealed with her remains to be discovered by individuals who were not part of the conspiracy to cover up her murder. Morrison realized that whoever had placed the knife with her body had been counting on this eventual exhumation to bring the truth to light. Morrison's final journal entry, dated December 15, 1856, recorded his decision to leave Montgomery immediately, rather than wait for Constance Grant's body to be exhumed. He had concluded that the criminal network was too powerful and well-connected to be defeated by evidence alone, and that his own survival required immediate departure from Alabama. The photographer arranged for his evidence to be delivered to federal authorities after his departure, hoping that national law enforcement officials would have the resources and independence necessary to pursue justice for Constance Grant's murder. Samuel Morrison left Montgomery on December 18, 1856, traveling by riverboat to New Orleans and then by ship to New York, where he established a new photographic practice under a different name. His evidence regarding Constance Grant's murder was delivered to federal authorities as planned, but no arrests were ever made in connection with her death. The criminal network that had killed her continued operating until the outbreak of the Civil War disrupted their activities and scattered their members throughout the changing South. The Grant estate was sold as planned in January of 1857, with Elijah and Martha Grant relocating to Texas, where they lived quietly until their deaths in the 1870s. Constance Grant's body was exhumed during the property transfer and reburied in Montgomery's Oakwood Cemetery, where her grave remains today, marked only by a simple stone bearing her name and the dates of her birth and death. No record exists of any unusual objects being discovered during the exhumation, suggesting that whoever had placed the knife with her body had retrieved it before the grave was officially opened. Thomas Whitfield remained in the Tennessee Sanitarium until 1861, when the institution was closed due to the Civil War. His subsequent fate is unknown, though records suggest that he may have died during the conflict, possibly as a result of his persistent mental disturbance. The Whitfield family's business operations in Mississippi were destroyed during the war, eliminating their financial resources and social connections that might have protected them from eventual prosecution for their criminal activities. Morrison's photographic evidence of Constance Grant's death remained in federal archives until the 1920s, when a researcher studying Civil War-era crime discovered the daguerreotype plates and Morrison's accompanying documentation. However, by that time, all the individuals involved in the conspiracy had been dead for decades, making prosecution impossible and reducing the case to a historical curiosity that generated brief academic interest before being forgotten again. The mystery of Constance Grant's murder was never officially solved, though Morrison's investigation provided compelling evidence that she had been killed to prevent her from exposing a criminal network that operated throughout the antebellum South. Her death represented one of countless tragedies that occurred during a period when local law enforcement was often corrupted by the same economic interests it was supposed to regulate, leaving victims without recourse to justice and allowing perpetrators to escape consequences for their actions. The knife visible in Morrison's daguerreotype images remains the most tangible evidence of Constance Grant's attempt to defend herself against her killers. Preserved in photographic form long after the actual weapon disappeared, along with most other traces of the conspiracy that claimed her life. The image stands as testimony to the courage of a young woman who chose to risk everything in pursuit of justice, even when she understood that her investigation would likely result in her death. Today, Montgomery's Oakwood Cemetery contains hundreds of graves dating to the 1850s, including Constance Grant's simple marker that gives no indication of the circumstances surrounding her death. Visitors to the cemetery occasionally notice that her grave is frequently adorned with fresh flowers, though no one has ever identified the individual responsible for maintaining this tribute to her memory. Local historians suggest that someone still remembers her story and chooses to honor her sacrifice. Even though the truth about her murder has been lost to time, the Grant estate property was eventually subdivided for residential development during the 20th century, with no trace remaining of the original structures that witnessed Constance Grant's final days. However, construction workers who developed the land in the 1960s reported discovering the remnants of a stone-lined basement chamber that had been deliberately sealed with heavy masonry, suggesting that someone had taken great care to hide evidence of activities that occurred on the property during the Grant family's residence. Inside this sealed chamber, workers found fragments of personal belongings and documents that had been damaged beyond recognition by decades of moisture and decay. Among these remains were pieces of what appeared to be women's clothing and jewelry, consistent with the 1850s period, though nothing that could be definitively connected to Constance Grant or her investigation. The discovery was reported to local authorities, but no formal investigation was conducted since the findings were deemed too degraded to provide useful evidence about historical events. Morrison's photographic equipment and remaining daguerreotype plates were eventually donated to the Alabama Department of Archives and History, where they remained in storage until being rediscovered during a 1968 inventory project. The plates showing Constance Grant holding the knife were examined by modern photographic experts who confirmed that the images had not been altered or manipulated using techniques available in the 1850s. This verification supported Morrison's claims about the impossible nature of what he had captured, though it provided no explanation for how such images could have been created. The archivist who rediscovered Morrison's plates noted that they were accompanied by a sealed envelope containing additional documentation that had been prepared according to Morrison's instructions for opening only if his death was confirmed to have occurred under suspicious circumstances. Since Morrison had died peacefully in New York in 1891, this envelope remained sealed until 1968, when curiosity finally prompted its examination by historical researchers studying the Civil War period. The envelope contained Morrison's complete account of his investigation into Constance Grant's death, including names, dates, and detailed descriptions of the criminal network he believed was responsible for her murder. This documentation provided historians with their first comprehensive view of organized crime in antebellum Montgomery, revealing connections between legitimate businesses and illegal activities that had been completely hidden from contemporary law enforcement. Morrison's evidence also identified specific individuals who had participated in the conspiracy, though their deaths decades earlier made criminal prosecution impossible. Modern researchers who studied Morrison's documentation concluded that Constance Grant had indeed uncovered evidence of a sophisticated smuggling operation that used cotton shipments to transport stolen goods and contraband throughout the southern United States. The network had involved dozens of participants, including merchants, transportation operators, and government officials who facilitated the illegal activities in exchange for substantial bribes. Constance's investigation had threatened to expose the entire operation to federal authorities, making her murder essential to the conspirators' continued survival. The researchers also determined that the knife visible in Morrison's daguerreotype images had likely been placed with Constance's body by Rebecca Washington, the missing Grant family servant whose disappearance had never been explained. Rebecca had probably been working with Constance during her investigation and had managed to conceal the weapon before the young woman's death. retrieving it afterward to create the photographic evidence that would preserve proof of the murder. Rebecca's subsequent disappearance suggested that she had been killed to prevent her from revealing what she knew about the conspiracy. Analysis of Morrison's evidence revealed that the criminal network responsible for Constance Grant's murder had operated from approximately 1850 through 1861, generating millions of dollars in illegal profits before being disrupted by the Civil War. The network's activities had included smuggling stolen merchandise, evading federal taxes on interstate commerce, and facilitating the transport of illegal goods to international markets through Gulf Coast ports. Constance's investigation had focused specifically on the financial mechanisms that allowed these activities to be concealed within legitimate business operations. The historical research also confirmed Morrison's suspicion that Constance Grant's death had been accomplished through deliberate arsenic poisoning administered over several weeks. Medical records from the period supported this conclusion, as did testimony from surviving family members who were interviewed during the 1960s investigation. The poisoning had been carefully timed to coincide with the conclusion of Constance's investigation, ensuring that she died before she could present her evidence to federal authorities. Morrison's documentation provided the final piece of evidence needed to understand the complete scope of Constance Grant's courage and the magnitude of the conspiracy that claimed her life. She had been conducting a professional-level investigation that required extensive planning, careful documentation, and significant personal risk. Her work had uncovered criminal activities that involved some of Montgomery's most prominent citizens, making her death inevitable once the conspirators realized the extent of her knowledge. The case of Constance Grant was officially closed by Alabama authorities in 1969, with her death being reclassified from natural causes to murder by person or persons unknown. This change in official status provided some measure of posthumous justice for a young woman whose sacrifice had been forgotten for more than a century. However, the passage of time had made it impossible to pursue criminal charges against anyone involved in the conspiracy, leaving the case permanently unsolved from a legal perspective. Today, Constance Grant's grave in Montgomery's Oakwood Cemetery bears a new marker that acknowledges her role in investigating criminal activities that threatened her community during the antebellum period. The marker was installed in 1970 by the Alabama Historical Society in recognition of her courage and determination in pursuing justice despite personal danger. Fresh flowers continue to appear regularly at her grave, suggesting that her story has found new admirers among people who appreciate her willingness to risk everything for the truth. The daguerreotype images, created by Samuel Morrison, remain on display at the Alabama Department of Archives and History, where they serve as unique historical documents that combine photographic artistry with criminal evidence from the 1850s. Visitors often comment on the haunting quality of the images, particularly the impossible knife that serves as eternal testimony to Constance Grant's preparation for the confrontation that ultimately claimed her life. The photographs stand as proof that some truths cannot be buried, even when powerful people invest significant resources in concealing them from history.